Good, as I say, afternoon, evening, morning for everybody around the world. It really is a great privilege to introduce Josiah Ober and welcome him to AI for EQ and ISTIS. Josiah is Mitsotakis Professor and Professor of Political Science in the School of Humanities and Science at Stanford University. And he specializes in the study of political thought and practice of the ancient Greek world, and demonstrates its contemporary relevance to society and the political economy of the world around us. We are actually particularly grateful to scholars like Josh now and Katina in the previous session, who frankly really are torchbearers and a moral compass for us in what are dark ages and really hard times. For Josh, this has been found in his advocacy of democracy as a legitimate system of political economy, which is critically based on civic education, civic participation, and civic dignity. It's a great pleasure to have Josh here. And thank you also, Josh. I know you have a hard deadline for a book, but knowing that is a dark headline, hard deadline is good news for me, because that's my next paper sorted out. So thank you. I'm looking forward to your book. Yeah. So with that, Josh, thank you very much again for speaking to us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's really a great pleasure to be here and an honor. And I feel quite humbled that I'm going to try to say something to people who know so much about so many things about which I know so little. So I'm going to address the question today that I take it is been already raised at this conference about servitude. And the question I want to ask is, what is wrong with servitude? That is, as indenture, as a term of bondage, or outright slavery. And what has that got to do with AI, with social media, the nature of the contemporary workplace? Well, let me just begin with the very obvious. The cruel master who harms the servant in some overt way, let's say by whipping or sexual exploitation. This is clearly a moral horror. I mean, there's no reason to debate that. But there are many forms of servitude that are less explicitly awful. One can even imagine an ideally benevolent masters who do nothing to harm their servants. What's wrong in that case with the master-servant relationship, if anything? A body of what's called neo-republican work on ethics and political theory has tried to answer that question by reference to the value of liberty, or just freedom, work by Philip Pettit, Quentin Skinner, and many others in their wake. Their point is that a master exercises domination even when not directly interfering in any way with the servant's choices. The problem is that the master could always interfere. Benevolence is the master's choice, not the servant's choice. So servants are always subject to the master's choices, which might change at any moment. So the servants remain, in an important sense, unfree. They're always looking over their shoulder, as it were, exercising prior restraint on themselves in anticipation of the interference that hasn't come yet, but always could come later. I think that the neo-republicans are on the right track, but we can go further. So I suggest that we jump back a couple of millennia to Aristotle, who in the Ethics and the Politics develops a full-featured argument about the wrongness of being a complete human being in a condition of servitude. Aristotle's theory shows that slavery is bad for the enslaved person, whether it is involuntary, the person taken as a slave, or voluntary, in which case the person chooses by the habits of their life to live under the control of another. Now, there are many problems, well known to philosophers, with Aristotle's account of freedom and slavery, but also, I think, a good deal of value for us today. Indeed, some of the value for us comes from the most problematic part of Aristotle's theory, his argument for the necessity of natural slaves. We'll get to that at the end of this talk. The central value of Aristotle for thinking about the wrongness of servitude lies in his account of the end, that is, the goal of human life, as complete freedom, in Greek eudaimonia. Now, that is sometimes translated as happiness, but it doesn't mean just subjective happiness. Aristotle supposes that you might be subjectively happy and yet not in a condition of freedom. Say, for example, you were hooked up to some sort of pleasure machine in some version of the matrix where those who were hooked up are caused to feel subjective pleasure but have no choice in the matter. Aristotle supposed, I think rightly, that certain conditions must be met in order for a human life to go well, for an individual to flourish. The basic condition is that we must have the opportunity freely to exercise the capacities that define the human being, that is, that differentiate us as humans from other animals. To decide what those capacities are, we must understand what kind of being we are. Since for Aristotle and for me, we are part of biological nature, that means asking, what kind of animals are we? Famously, Aristotle's answer is, we're political animals. But what does that mean? Well, first it means that we're social rather than solitary. And then we are community dwellers rather than just living in random herds. And finally, we're producers of common goods. That is, together, we make things that enable us to live our lives together, things we could not produce just as individuals who happen to live nearby one another and exchange things with one another. Thus far, we're in the same category. We humans are in the same category as harvester ants and honeybees. Aristotle makes this explicit comparison. There's one other subdivision. We humans are the kind of animals that, like ants, according to Aristotle and modern ant behavior research, the kind of animals that do not require a ruler. We have the capacity to live each as our own master. This means that the social order that we create is, or at least can be, a product of self-organization. Social order can be, for us, bottom up, produced by the contribution of each, rather than top down, created by the orders of a boss. Now, humans are not only self-organizing and common goods producing, kind of political animals, but we're also the most political of animals. Why is that? Because the common goods that we produce and make use of are more complex and, for Aristotle, of higher value than, say, the honey or the store of grain that is produced by bees or ants, the examples of other kinds of political animals. And thus, to flourish, we, as humans, must not only live, that is, gain physical security and material welfare like all other animals, but we must also, if we're to flourish, live well in this superior common end sense. As social beings who live in communities, we must, to flourish as individuals, live in some sort of moral community. And note, that doesn't mean a moralistic community. It means moral in the sense of a community that is just and good. We can flourish as individuals in moral communities, according to Aristotle, only by exercising our natural capacities. Our natural capacities include not only a strong kind of sociability, the political animals business, but also the use of reason, that is, the capacity to understand right and wrong, as well as advantage and disadvantage, and then language, capacity to communicate in highly complex ways and to communicate about the things that we reason over, right and wrong, advantage and disadvantage. So to be a fully realized individual is to live in a community, a moral community, contributing to it through reason and speech with the aim of producing high order common goods, as well as security and material welfare, and importantly, also having the leisure that allows for philosophical contemplation. but contemplation gets us into territory that I won't have time to explain today. When things go right, then, we humans create and maintain social order by ruling and being ruled over in turns. That is, we share the burdens of doing the work of the community. None of us is ruled over all the time. No one is a servant, and we need have no master but our collective selves. In brief, then, the conditions of optimum flourishing require that individuals who employ speech and reason to work at building and maintaining together their self-organizing, bossless community. So to cut to the chase, to flourish, we ought to be, or ought to hope to be, or ought to try to be citizens in a democracy. That is, using reason and communication towards our collective good. So that is Aristotle's answer, or part of it anyway, for why it is bad to be a slave or an indentured servant. Such a person does, by definition, have a master. He or she is not able to employ the human capacities of reason and speech fully and freely, without prior constraint, along with others, in pursuit of joint and several flourishing within a self-governing, masterless community. No matter how benevolent the master, no matter if the master is not evil or accumulates a whole lot of likes or dreams of a world that is a better place, if there is a master, the constraint is still there. The full and free exercise of human capacities is shrunken and deformed in Aristotle's moral psychology. Our souls are corrupted and worsened. Soul for Aristotle being just moral psychology. So to the extent that the communities in which we live, whether they're virtual or physical, are ruled over by a master, that is, when the rules are set by someone at the top and not by us as citizens, then we are made worse, we fail to flourish, and that is fundamentally tragic. So the question is the tragedy avoidable? And that brings us to Aristotle's strange and in many ways abhorrent theory of natural slavery. So Aristotle is insistent that in principle there are some human beings who are suited by nature to being servants or slaves. His theory goes like this: some humans are suited for enslavement and not for ruling along with others because of certain psychological defects. The defect is not lack of intelligence as such, but rather an incapacity to reason with others towards common interests. Aristotle's natural slaves are infantile in the sense that they cannot determine what is best for themselves and others through deliberating with themselves and with others. These natural slaves are better off than or best off under the control of a master. And so natural slaves, unlike complete humans, can justly be enslaved within a moral community. Now, the problem with the theory, recognized by Aristotle himself, is that natural slaves are not readily identified. Greece was not a race slavery society, very different from the United States or other race slavery societies. Now, Aristotle wishes aloud, at least he writes it down, that nature had included some physical marker to determine who's a natural slave and who's not, but he admits there is no such marker. So why does he make up this weird fictional category of incomplete humans? Well, he does so because he believes that providing the labor necessary to keep society going, that is, to ensure the living that makes living well possible, he thought that providing that kind of labor required a lot of humans to do menial work under the direct control of others. And he thinks, perhaps not unreasonably, that constantly doing menial work under the direction of a master corrupts the soul of a complete human. It fails to allow for flourishing. And so to allow himself to imagine a society without exploitation, and without corruption of human souls, Aristotle also imagines the relevant kind of menial workers, incomplete humans who are not corrupted by working under a master because their souls are already defective, quote, by nature. Now, this is a classic example of a philosopher biting the bullet of facts don't fit the theory, so we just get rid of the facts. There, in fact, are no natural slaves, but his theory demanded that there were. So Aristotle's theory of natural slavery would not be interesting, except that Aristotle also imagines something like autonomous machines. He writes that if looms could weave on their own, if liars could play themselves, and so on, there would be no need for slaves. He explicitly says that this is so, that because no such machines exist, that natural slaves must exist in a benevolent universe. So you see where this is going. Today, we do live, or we're about to live, in Aristotle's thought experimental world of autonomous machines with looms and liars and much else that run on themselves. And these machines are on the brink of becoming intelligent. The question remains, intelligent in what way? Well, if we follow the logic of Aristotle's theory of bossless human flourishing, and we accept the need for a lot of labor being done for us to live, then the answer is that AI must be different from human intelligence in just the way that Aristotle's fictional natural slave is different from a real complete human being. AI must be permanently ruled over, doing the work for us that frees us from the drudgery and soul-destroying condition of being under the control of a master. The machines must have the kind of intelligence that is not harmed or corrupted by being in that always ruled over condition. Now, I'm a political theorist and a historian, not a programmer. I have no idea how to create the right kind of Aristotelian intelligent but permanently ruled over machines. But I suppose that having what amounts to a philosophical roadmap might help those who do have the skills to design intelligent machines of the right kind, that is, of the kind that enables and indeed promotes human flourishing. And meanwhile, just suppose that we were to embrace Aristotle's argument that complete human flourishing requires the full exercise of our human capacities for sociability and reason and communication. And suppose that full exercise of those capacities requires masterless collective self-governance of the communities in which we live our lives, in which we communicate and reason with one another. Well, if we were to accept that argument, it would have some obvious implications for the sort of desirable reforms of the workplaces and the social media platforms in and on which so many of us spend so much of our lives. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Josh. So we've certainly got some time for some questions. So if anybody would like to throw something in there from the audience, you can either ask them live or put them in the chat. I can't see one there, but I will ask one to start off with, if I may, which is this idea that sort of slightly inspired by what Katina was saying this morning. So I'm sorry you missed that, Josh, but she was talking about the way that taxi drivers were being exploited, and they were sort of like almost jumping out of one frying pan into another from the deregulation. And you know, everybody was suffering as a consequence, and just a few people were being enriched. So is it that, you know, this idea that, you know, Aristotle had to create this category of incomplete humans, while actually, you know, in the modern day, people are just basically othering others? They really don't think of this, the 1% don't think of the 99% as humans, yeah, which is why they can treat them so abominably. Is there any correlation between these things, do you think?
Yeah, I think there probably is. I mean, I think that we find intuitively something grotesque about the idea that by sort of furthering our own interests, we're really destroying other people. I mean, at least, you know, anyone with any moral sensibility finds something grotesque about that. And yet we must recognize that much of what we do, in fact, is harmful for other people. We put them in this condition of being, in a sense, our servants, just working to our will and under often, you know, miserable conditions. And so how do we square that circle? Well, at least one way to square the circle is to sort of distance them from us. Well, we're one kind of being, they're another kind of being, no doubt. They're doing as well as they can for the sort of being that they are. Now, we don't necessarily think that all through, but I think that is the kind of othering that often does go on, at least in the kind of background psychological justification that allows us to continue living our lives as we ordinarily do.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've got a question from Maita, if I may. Maita, I'll ask it for you. Maita asks, is the idea of complete humans related to education? So, you know, if we do need to reason and agree between ourselves and negotiate and or learn to agree, yes. Thanks for the qualification. So that, you know, one of the things that we can see in some education systems is how critical thinking is really taken out of it. So almost we are educating this incomplete humans. Yeah. So. Yes,
yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And Aristotle would say, yes, indeed. If you read his great work on called The Politics, the end of it, where he's discussing the community you ought to want to live in. You know, he calls it the city-state of our prayers, you know, the one we would pray for. But it's meant to be real. It's not just a utopia. A lot of the discussion is about education. He thinks education is absolutely essential, that although we are by nature these political animals that are capable of this kind of perfection, of flourishing. In order to get there, we actually have to have the right kind of upbringing. We have to develop the right kind of, now in his language, virtues. We have to learn self-control. We have to become the kind of beings that we have the potential to become, but only through educating ourselves. He thinks there's all kinds of errors, cognitive errors that we fall into. Once again, fail to learn to think critically. But we can also fail by simply developing the capacity for instrumental reasoning, figuring out what strategically would be best for me or my kind or my group, and ignoring that common good, which he thinks is necessary for us to live in a moral community. And in order to do that, we actually have to recognize that there is some common good, that my own good is part and parcel of a larger good, the good of us, some extended us, and that I have to sometimes sacrifice what is, at least in my own short-term interest, in order to really genuinely gain what is in my true interest, that is to be a citizen of a flourishing moral community. So I think that's hard. I mean, you actually have to get beyond what he imagines as a natural human impulse to benefit yourself through the use of a particular kind of reasoning, this kind of instrumental reasoning. So that takes education as well, right? You have to get people past that. You have to learn to be not only a reason-using animal, but a moral reason-using animal. And all of that ultimately, and this is sort of the book that I have this hard deadline for, we have to learn to negotiate with one another. We have to learn to bargain with one another. And I think that really is something that we have to learn. We have to learn that in the agreements that we make with one another, aiming to make our human community more moral, better, more capable of allowing flourishing for all rather than just for a few, we have to make some compromises. We're not going to get to perfection, at least by the standards of any one of us. And so, part of, I think, the education that is necessary if we're really to achieve what we could achieve within communities is recognizing that every agreement that we make, and we must make agreements with one another, is inherently imperfect, subject to revision, should be at some point revised, but we have to have agreements at any given moment that allow us to live together. So we have to recognize the imperfection at any given moment of the, say, constitutional order that we live under. And that's hard too. People want perfect justice. People want a world that is ideal. And the recognition that you have to compromise your ideals in order to move forward towards a better world is really a hard thing to learn. And I think it needs to be learned.
Absolutely. I mean, freedom depends on others, basically. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, exactly.
But then, do you think that there are these cognitive things going on? How is it that we're able to switch between very democratic and very elitist structures? I mean, most of us here are academics in a university, and this is a deeply hierarchical and non-democratic structure, but we all agree to actually operate within its constraints. So.
Yeah, and I think the big, among the major challenges for democracy is recognizing that there are hierarchies of various sorts that we're not going to get beyond. There's simply hierarchies of knowledge. In any given domain, there are some people who know a lot more than other people. And so for a democracy to say everybody knows everything they need to go into a debate and a talk at whatever length, and we'll have a lovely consensus arise out of this, is simply false. We have to learn to attend to experts in various domains, and that means we have to respect and trust experts in various domains. We have to trust that they are not going to seize power and rule over us by use of their domain knowledge. So I think, once again, that's a matter of learning. We have to learn how to do that, how to be the kind of citizen that is able to defer to certain kinds of expertise, and yet keep control of the experts, keep the experts always accountable to ourselves. And that's a lot of work on designing of democratic mechanisms. We have to actually think of what are the institutions, as well as what are the background norms that we have to develop in order to make that possible. And I think that doesn't just come naturally. We have to learn that as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, I have a colleague, Samina, who I hope she was listening to that answer very closely, because she's been doing this interesting study on the emergence of expertise, self-organizing systems. Yeah, I will just take a few more minutes out of the panel, because we've got another couple of questions which I really would like to put to you, Josh. Peter Lewis asks, are you saying that it is okay or even helpful to think of intelligent machines as slaves? And what might the consequences of that be, given that some AIs might end up presenting as human or animal-like? you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is really the bullet we need to bite down on. And the development of AI, to the extent to which humans are going to be the developers of AI, and obviously with machine learning that gets complicated. But I think that really is the challenge, that unless we can imagine a world in which we don't have anything that has intelligence of any sort engaged in menial labor, what I'm calling menial labor, that is labor under the direct control of others and for the good of others, then we're going to need to have machines that do have this feature of not being corrupted by, not being, having their souls, if we imagine a machine having a soul, degraded by that condition of permanent submission to the authority of the humans. So that's a design problem, and I think it's a real one. And it ultimately ends up being an ethical problem, because at the moment in which the intelligence is developed that is of this human sort, it has these key features, then presumably it has the same susceptibility to corruption, with the same moral problem about putting it in a condition of being corrupted. And that's really the issue I think we need to really think hard about.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. And one last question. I'd really like to follow up on that debate, but perhaps we can do it offline. Chitrabath Radhakrishnan, sorry to the pronunciation, murdering your name, but asks a very interesting question. He says thank you as well, by the way, for the fascinating talk, which on behalf of all of us. Yeah. Yes. But really interesting question about Aristotle making distinctions between what is in between those who are capable of natural slaves and the masters. And I can see this because here Aristotle's effectively putting a binary condition on what must be a distribution, with a vague predicate, natural slave. I mean,
right? No, a great question. And basically, the question is, I think the way to answer the question is that Aristotle worries that people can self-enslave through practice. So there are these beings, he posits, that are natural slaves that are in their best condition throughout their lives by being enslaved. Then there are complete humans, but complete humans who are in a condition of putting themselves under the control of a master, take commands systematically through the course of their lives, will become slaves by practice, will become slave-like, will have all of the features of the natural slave, except they will have gotten there by the deformation of their souls rather than simply by being born with an imperfect soul, or imperfect in this particular way. So that's I think that Aristotle thinks that's a pretty wide category of people who have at least begun to get onto that bad pathway towards self-enslavement, or are fully corrupted through and have simply lost the capacity to reason in their own interest along with others. And that's really sort of his horror about the world that he thinks most people live in, and that's the world he wants to get out of. He wants to get to a world in which that self-enslavement is not necessary part of getting the work done that we need to get done, and that's why he wants to bring the natural slaves into the story.
Right. Brilliant. We have got the panel next, Josh, but I mean, on behalf of everybody listening, thank you so much for that talk. That was really thought-provoking and really helping us with the agenda on this workshop. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thanks.
There was some way of showing the applause. Yeah.